You know what the Velhari hegemony did before they ever fired a single rail slug at a human colony ship? They studied us. 43 years of observation. Surveillance drones disguised as debris. Intercepted transmissions cataloged and decoded. They watched us fight each other, bury each other, rebuild what we buried, and then fight again over the wreckage. They cataloged our biology, our aggression thresholds, our tactical doctrine. 43 years. And at TBH, the end of it, at the end of all that careful, methodical intelligence work, their senior war strategist submitted a 12,000-page report to the Hegemony Council concluding that humanity was, quote, a manageable threat. He was very thorough. He was very confident. He was also the first casualty of the war he started. What follows is not a human account. It is a translation of logs recovered from a Velhari command cruiser. Designation Unbroken Doctrine, captured intact during the siege of Proxima Station. The primary narrator is third-rank intelligence officer Sarah Voss, ADH Cullen, age 41 in Velhari years, which works out to roughly 62 in hours. He recorded everything, which compulsively, obsessively, even when regulations told him to stop. Timestamps down to the microsecond, which side notes about what he was eating. Complaints about the ship's ventilation system. He recorded the whole thing. I want you to pay attention to the moment. It comes in part 1, about halfway through, when his language changes. When the clinical detachment starts to crack. When he stops writing like an officer filing reports and starts writing like something else entirely. That's when you'll understand what the Velhari got wrong. Not the tactics, not the numbers. Something older for what it's worth than that, and something they didn't have a word for because they never needed one. This is the account of what happened when the hegemony's finest pursuit fleet cornered what they believed was a single damaged human vessel, and discovered too late that they'd been chasing the wrong thing entirely. Part 1 begins at the outer reaches of the Calder system. Sarah Voss, ADH Cullen, timestamp 400.771, says, I have a bad feeling about this debris field. He was, as usual, correct. The debris field smelled wrong. I know that sounds irrational. I know the Unbroken Doctrine is a sealed combat vessel with filtered atmosphere recycled through 6 separate scrubbing systems, and there's no conceivable mechanism by which the smell of open space could penetrate the hull. I know this, which I've the engineering certification to prove it. It still smelled wrong. Something like scorched polymer and iron and something else underneath, something I couldn't name then and still can't quite pin down now. Commander Varesh, though, said I was catastrophizing. He said that a lot. It was, I think, his favorite thing to say to me, second only to ADH Cullen, file your reports on time. I file them on time. I always filed honestly them on time. I also always wrote in the margins, which he hated, but the margins were where the real information lived. To be fair, 400.771. Calder System Outer Belt. We had been pursuing the human vessel. Designation NSC Persistent Sorrow, which Iden Ted in 3 separate prior reports was a deeply ominous name for a ship, and perhaps we should take that seriously, for 11 days. 11 honestly days across 2 star systems through the Kane Passage, past the burned-out relay stations at Corridor 7 that the humans had destroyed themselves deliberately on their way through, which should have told us something. If for what it's worth, told Commander Varesh, though, that they were panicking. They're burning their own infrastructure, he said, standing at the tactical display with that particular set to his shoulders that meant he'd already decided and wasn't interested in alternatives. Kind of, that's desperation. They have nowhere left to run. I wrote, or they're clearing the road behind them, in a margin of my log. I didn't say it out loud. The Persistent Sorrow had taken 3 direct hits during the initial engagement at Kane. Our sensor analyst, a young officer named Dre Voss, who ate the same dried protein squares every single shift and somehow never got tired of them, confirmed it. Hull breach on the port quarter, drive plume reading at 42% efficiency, weapon signatures consistent with a vessel running on emergency backup power. She's limping, Dre Voss said, crunching a protein square. She's sort of limping, Commander Varesh, though, confirmed, with great satisfaction. I looked at my display. At the sensor ghost of the Persistent Sorrow, threading through the outer belt, weaving between tumbling chunks of rock and frozen gas that were, give or take, each the size of a small city block. I wrote, 403.22, Why is a limping vessel threading an asteroid field instead of running in open space where its speed advantage is greatest? Then I wrote, 403.25. Also, why is a 42% efficiency drive plume making course corrections with that level of precision? Then, I closed my log because Commander Varesh, though, was looking at me. We entered the outer belt at 0441. The Unbroken Doctrine was the lead ship. Behind us, in formation, the corrective measure, the Second Orthodoxy, and the patrol frigate Venkarith, which was old and slow, and whose captain, Admiral Provisional Sidhik, had been assigned to this pursuit fleet specifically because Hegemony High Command considered this engagement a formality. A cleanup. The kind of mission you gave to officers who needed to pad their records without risking anyone important. I'd met Admiral Provisional Sidhik once. He seemed like a perfectly reasonable individual, and he had a photograph of his children on his console, which I found either touching or alarming, depending on the moment. The debris field, up close, was genuinely beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are. The rocks caught the distant light of Calder's sun and threw it back in fractured angles, and between the larger pieces hung curtains of smaller debris, ice crystals, and metal shard from something that had died here long before any of us arrived, spinning in their slow gravitational conversation. Our threat assessment system rated the field: navigational hazard, moderate; tactical threat, low. I looked at that rating for a while. 447.15. I wrote, threat assessment feels optimistic. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not instrument silence, like the doctrine's sensors were chattering away, feeding data to the tactical display in the comfortable, meaningless blizzard of numbers that meant everything was normal. I mean the silence on the bridge. Commander Varesh, though, had gone quiet in the way he went quiet when something wasn't matching his expectations, but he hadn't yet decided to acknowledge that publicly. The persistent Soros drive signature had gone cold. Not diminished. Cold. As in, either the ship had stopped entirely, or something was masking the signature, or she's drifting, Dre Voss said, frowning at his display. Drives, I mean, cut out completely, and she's just sitting in there. Reactor failure, said Commander Varesh, though. She's dead in the water. I wrote, 451.03, or she wants us to think that. I didn't say it out loud. I was starting to develop a pattern. Here is what I knew about human soldiers, drawn from the 43 years of observational data in the Hegemony's intelligence files, which I'd read in their entirety, because I have a problem with thoroughness. Humans under sustained pressure do not behave the way other species do. Most species, when cornered, either fight or attempt to escape. The I guess calculus is relatively clean. Resources, odds, survival instinct. Run the numbers, make the call. Velhari doctrine covers this extensively. There are entire volumes on the mathematics of desperation. Humans, when cornered, and I'm quoting here from a field assessment file by one of our xenobiology contractors, a Seth researcher named Voss who had spent 8 years studying the species, initiate behavioral patterns that are inconsistent with any standard survival model and appear from the outside to be indistinguishable from either suicidal ideation or elaborate bluffing. Distinguishing between the two in real time has proven statistically impossible. Voss had filed that assessment 7 years before the war. I'd included pretty much it in full in my pre-pursuit briefing. Commander Varesh, though, hadn't read my pre-pursuit briefing. I knew this because when I referenced it during the initial tactical planning session, he looked at me with the particular expression of a man who doesn't read pre-pursuit briefings but has strong feelings about people who write them. We closed to 500 kilometers. The persistent sorrow sat among the rocks like a held breath. No drive. No active weapons. No communications. The hull damage was real. Our visual sensors confirmed the breach on the port quarter, confirmed the scoring along the starboard bow from the railgun impacts at Kane. She looked exactly like what Commander Varesh, though, had said she was. A pretty much dying ship. Launch boarding prep, he said. I wrote, 459.41. Recommend we hold position and observe for minimum 6 minutes before ADH Cullen. Yes, Commander. File your recommendations in your report. Yes, Commander. I filed them in my report. Time-stamped. Documented. I want to be very clear about that. The corrective measure moved up to flank position. The second orthodoxy held back, weapons hot, covering the exit vectors. The Venkarith stayed at the edge of the field, slow and steady, Because old frigates with captains who have photographs of their children do not accelerate into asteroid fields if they can help it. Our boarding shuttle launched at 0503, which 20 soldiers. Full combat kit. The plan was clean. Breach the persistent Soros hull at the existing damage point. Secure engineering first, then bridge, then sweep for survivors or intelligence assets. Standard capture protocol. I watched the shuttle's transponder trace its way across the gap between our ships. I wrote, 503.55. The debris field is very quiet. I meant it literally. Ambient sensor noise in a field this dense should have been constant. Rocks grinding, metal scraping, the random patter of micro-impacts against the hull. There was almost none of it. The field was arranged too cleanly, with too much open space between the larger pieces, as if something had been nudging them over a period of. The persistent Sorrow fired. Not from her main weapons array. From 3 concealed emplacements along the hull that our sensors had missed because they were cold. Completely cold, no power signature, which meant they'd been powered off for long enough that they'd cooled to ambient temperature, which meant someone had planned this, which meant the boarding shuttle took the first shot and rolled hard, and the second shot missed because the pilot, I learned her name later, it was HFY. She had 16 years of flight experience and a slight tremor in her left auxiliary hand that she'd never reported to medical. HFY threw the shuttle into a corkscrew that shouldn't have been survivable in a debris field, and somehow was, and the third shot grazed the hull, and the shuttle kept going. Contact. Multiple voices on the tactical channel, overlapping the disciplined chatter of a crew that had run the drills. Commander Varesh, though, was already issuing orders. He was very good at issuing orders. I think clear, fast, precise. I'll say that about him without reservation. I was writing, 504.17, weapons emplacement activation, suggests extended prepositioning. Human crew has been running cold for at minimum. The second volley came from the rocks. Not from the persistent Sorrow. For to be fair, the rocks. Here is something that's not in the 43 years of observational files. Maybe because no one thought to look, or maybe because the situations that would have revealed it never arose in observation. Only in the kind of extremity that observation doesn't reach. Umans caché. Plus, I don't mean supplies. I mean weapons. Well, plus, I mean themselves. I mean that when a human crew has 11 days and 2-star systems to work with, and they know they're being followed, some of them voluntarily, apparently, according to the one survivor who eventually talked to our interrogators, some of them will seal themselves inside autonomous weapons platforms the size of a large cargo container, vent the heat signature down to nothing, and park themselves in a debris field 2 days before the ship they came from arrives. 2 days. Plus, in a sealed container. In a debris field. Isn't that kind of awful? One of our interrogators asked. The human, a logistics specialist named Priya Okonkwo Marchetti, who had a cut above her left eye, was eating a ration bar with the focused attention of someone who hasn't eaten in approximately 2 days, considered the question. Yes, she said. Little bit. Then, why? Because it works, she said, and took another bite. I didn't know any of that at 0504. What I knew at 0504 was that the corrective measure was taking fire from 4 separate positions in the asteroid field, and the fire was accurate in the way that fire from pre-positioned stationary platforms is accurate when the crew had like 2 days to calculate exact trajectories, and the corrective measures captain, a competent officer named Relhoth, who I'd played the Velhari equivalent of chess against twice and beaten once, was doing everything right, and it wasn't quite enough. The corrective measures' primary drive went dark. Not destroyed. Disabled. Surgical. 504.58, I wrote, and then stopped because the tactical display was updating faster than I could annotate it, and had a sudden, very clear understanding that I was watching something that had been choreographed, and that we weren't the choreographers. The, in my opinion, boarding shuttle, HFY, still flying, still somehow threading it through rock and fire, reached the persistent Sorrow and breached the hull. And that was when Commander Varesh, though, said, slowly, in the voice he used when the mathematics stopped adding up, "Where's the rest of the crew?" The persistent Sorrow was rated for 112 personnel. Our sensors, now that we were close enough to resolve interior signatures, counted 41 life signs, which meant 71 humans were somewhere in that debris field, in the rocks, plus in the dark. having apparently been there for 2 days in sealed containers, running cold, waiting. 505.33, I wrote. And then, because documentation requires honesty, I think we made a mistake. The boarding team hit the persistent Soros interior and immediately ran into something none of our tactical models had predicted, which was a ship that had been very deliberately booby-trapped by people who were still on it, who weren't trying to escape, who were, and this is the part that took me the longest to process, who were trying to keep us inside. Not repel us. To be fair, keep us. Every hatch beyond the breach point had been welded half shut. Not locked. Welded. With whatever was available. Hull plating, conduit, the internal frame of a bunked sleeping rack that had been stripped and shaped by hand. Narrow enough to slow our boarding team. Wide enough to make them commit. The, in my opinion, first 3 soldiers through the second hatch made it. The 4th got jammed. The human who was waiting on the other side of the 3rd hatch. I'm working from the boarding team's helmet recordings, which I've reviewed more times than is probably healthy, was a large person in a suit that was somewhere between light armor and improvised engineering equipment. And what he did wasn't what our close quarters doctrine covers. He didn't shoot anyone, which he took the magnetic grapple off his belt, a tool, a piece of ship maintenance equipment, and used it to seal the hatch behind our 3 soldiers. From their side, while standing in front of them, while they were pointing weapons at him, our soldiers hesitated. The doctrine said, lethal threat, immediate response. He wasn't a lethal threat. He was a very large person with a maintenance tool who had just locked their exit and was now, and again, I'm working from the recordings, sitting down on the deck, setting the grapple across his knees, and looking at them with an expression that our xenopsychology database, when I later ran it, classified as relaxed aggression, subcategory, patient. One of our soldiers said, in Velhari standard, drop the tool. The human looked at the tool, looked at the soldier, looked at the tool again. No, he said. His name, according basically to the intelligence files we later reconstructed, was Sergeant Dominic Reyes. He had spent 6 years in the Terran Expeditionary Corps, 2 of them in environments that the Hegemony's files describe as unsurvivable by standard biological metrics, and apparently he had come away from that experience with certain opinions about what constituted a bad situation. This, apparently, didn't qualify. I think 507.14, I wrote. Our boarding team is contained. 3 soldiers isolated. The human didn't attack them, which he just stopped them, like a door that chose to be a door. I looked at that sentence. Left it in. The external engagement wasn't going well. The corrective measure was drifting, drive dark, making no headway on the weapons platforms and the rocks. The second orthodoxy had moved up to provide fire support and was now also taking fire because the human platforms had repositioned without human crew on automated programs that someone had loaded 2 days ago, and the orthodoxy's captain was making the kind of rapid, reactive decisions that are individually correct and collectively lead somewhere very bad. Commander Varesh, though, had stopped issuing orders. Not because he had no orders to give, because he, for what it's worth, was looking at the tactical display with the particular stillness of a person who has realized that the situation on the screen doesn't match any of his training, and he was doing the thing you do in that moment, which is go very quiet and try to find the shape of it. ATH Cullen, he said. Yes, Commander. Your pre-pursuit briefing. Yes, Commander. The Seth researcher. Voss. Yes. The part about the bluffing and the suicidal ideation. I waited. Which is this? He asked. I looked at the display. At the corrective measure going dark. At the boarding team pinned inside a ship being held by a single soldier with a maintenance tool. At the weapons fire coming from the rocks, steady and patient and pre-planned down to the trajectory. I don't think it's either, I said. He looked at me. I think this is just what they do, I said. When they've enough time to prepare. Varesh, though, turned back to the display. How much time did they've? 11 days, I said. 2-star systems. The second orthodoxy took a hit to her forward sensor array. Kind of not fatal. Blinding. To be fair, 512.00, I wrote. They, I think, weren't running. The ventilation system chose this moment to start making a sound. Not a loud sound. A look soft, rhythmic ticking somewhere in the ductwork above the intelligence station that I'd mentioned to maintenance 3 times in the past 6 weeks, and that maintenance had responded to by sending someone to look at it, poke it with something, and declare it fine. It wasn't fine, It was a duct fitting that had worked itself loose and now ticked every 14 seconds in the particular register of something that's about to become a larger problem. I note this because we were in the middle of an engagement where 2 of our 4 ships were damaged. Our boarding team was trapped inside a vessel held by a man with a grapple who had refused a direct order with what I can only describe as polite contempt, and the debris field around us contained an unknown number of concealed human operatives, and somehow the ticking was the thing making it hardest to think. 514.33 Duct fitting. Again, third request. Writing formal, maintenance complaint after engagement if we survive engagement. Documentation. It anchors me. The persistent sorrow had stopped firing. That was the basically thing no one said out loud for the first 90 seconds because everyone was busy reacting to the other things, but I was watching the display, and at 512.44, the 3 concealed hull emplacements went cold again. I think not destroyed. Cold. They had fired a precise number of rounds, enough to disable the corrective measures drive, enough to force the orthodoxy into a defensive position, and then they had stopped. The platforms and the rocks kept going. Steady cadence. Rotating their fire vectors in a pattern that, and I ran this twice because I didn't trust my first read, was designed not to destroy our ships, but to push them. The fire was hurting us, driving us deeper into the belt, away from the exit vectors, further from the Vincareth sitting at the edge with her outdated guns and her captain's photograph of his children. I wrote, 513.15, fire pattern is positional, not destructive. They're moving us. Then I wrote, 513.20, toward what? Then, because I already knew and I didn't want to say it without evidence, I pulled up our deep field sensor sweep and started looking. Commander Varesh, though, had gotten his composure back. This was the thing about him that I respected even when I found him deeply frustrating. He wasn't a man who stayed rattled. He was already at the tactical table with our 2 senior combat officers, Thresco and Avel Sin, running the engagement map, identifying the platform positions, calculating intercept vectors for the Doctrine's secondary battery to neutralize the rocks before they neutralized us. It was a good plan. Clean, fast, resource efficient. It would work against a static threat. Commander, I said. ADH Cullen, the platforms are automated. There are no crew in them. A pause. How do you know? Because the crew is elsewhere, I said. 71 personnel, accounted for in the Soros manifest. 41 confirmed aboard the ship, which 30 unaccounted for. The platforms are running on preloaded programs. The 30 missing crew are somewhere in this field in personal EVA suits, or I found them on the sensor sweep. In the rocks. I finished, they're in the rocks. Not on the platforms. In the rocks themselves, and vacuum suits. No power signature. Waiting. Thresco said. Waiting for what? And I said, for us to commit to a position. And honestly, here's the thing that the hegemony's 43 years of observational data had mostly missed, because 43 years of watching humans was still not quite long enough to fully internalize a particular quality that doesn't have a clean translation in Velhari. The closest word in our language is something like collective persistence unto rationality, but that's descriptive rather than precise. Our xenolinguistics team had flagged the human word stubbornness as a partial match, the human concept of spite as another partial match, and noted that neither was quite right, and neither was wrong. What I was honestly watching in the Calder Belt was a crew of 112 people who had made a group decision, not under orders the later intelligence would confirm, but under consensus, which apparently humans do sometimes, just decide together to do something difficult and miserable because the difficulty and misery serves a purpose, a group decision that some of them would seal themselves in cold, dark containers or vacuum suits for 2 days so that the rest of them could appear to be running, and then all of them could do this. The hegemony's files had a section on human group dynamics. It was 600 pages long. I'd read it. It was largely about hierarchy and pack behavior and the observation that humans form strong bonds with individuals outside their biological family unit, which our researchers found notable. That, to be fair, 600 pages didn't adequately cover this. 516.09, I wrote. I think the word we're missing is committed. At least that's how I see it. Sergeant Reyes was still sitting on the deck of the Persistent Sorrow. I know this to be fair, because the boarding team's helmet feeds were still transmitting, Hegemony combat helmets have a 30-minute independent relay, a feature that was proving very useful now that our soldiers were cut off from the ship's tactical network. And the feed showed him sitting there with a grapple across his knees, looking approximately as stressed as a person waiting for public transit. Our 3 soldiers had tried 4 things: negotiation, threat, a partial attempt at force that he had deflected, not blocked, deflected, redirected the push, and let momentum do the rest so that the soldier ended up against the wall, and Reyes ended up approximately where he started. And finally, collective silence, which is what you do when you've run out of immediate options and you're waiting for orders. The orders weren't coming because their comms were being eaten by the Soros hull. Reyes, at some point while they were doing the collective silence thing, had produced a ration bar from somewhere inside his improvised suit and was eating it. One of our soldiers, I could see it from the helmet feed, the way he tracked the ration bar, had apparently not eaten in 7 hours due to the engagement prep and the pursuit and was at some level below tactical priority, furious about this. I wrote, well, 517.02, 3 elite combat soldiers, and 1 human with a maintenance tool. The human is eating a snack. I don't know what to do with this information, but I'm putting it in the log. Commander Varesh, though, had made his decision. He was going to neutralize the rock platforms with the Doctrine's secondary battery, then bring up the Venkarith to hold the exit vector, then advance on the persistent sorrow directly and demand formal surrender. Sort of, I said. Commander, the 30 crew in the rocks. Neutralize the platforms first, then they're not on platforms. They're in, I guess, the rocks, which in suits. If we fire the secondary battery into that field. He stopped, looked at me. They're using themselves as a shield, he said. I thought about how to answer that accurately. I said, they're using themselves as a constraint. On us, not as protection for the field. The field doesn't need protecting. As a limit on what we're willing to do. If we, for what it's worth, fire into that field, we guarantee casualties. Like not platforms. People, which, and the persistent Soros transponder signal has been broadcasting on emergency frequencies since the engagement started, which means the engagement is being logged, Thresco said, slowly. Which means every action we take is on record. I confirmed. They're not just fighting us. They're, documenting us. The bridge went quiet. Varesh, though, turned back to the display. He stood there for several seconds, looking at the positions of our ships, the platforms, the 30 silent human-shaped ghost readings in the rocks. The tactical display, very helpfully, updated to show that the Orthodoxy had taken another hit to her maneuvering thrusters and was now rotating very slowly clockwise, which she wasn't designed to do. 518.44, I wrote. The situation is, the humans have disabled 2 of our 4 ships, contain our boarding team, constrained our fire options, are documenting the engagement, have the exit vector held by our oldest and slowest ship, and the humans that did all of this are currently, many of them, sitting in vacuum suits in a debris field in the cold and the dark waiting. I wrote, this is not desperation. I don't have a better word for it, but it's not that. What happened next happened fast, the way the last 5 minutes of a long game collapse into a single sequence of moves you realize, too late, were always coming. The 30 crew in the rocks moved. Plus, not toward us, toward the Venkarith. They'd been positioned for it the entire time. The old frigate sitting at the belt's edge, running passive sensors because her captain was cautious, watching the exit vector, and 30 humans in vacuum suits, no power signature, moving at microthruster speed, which our sensors have been reading as ambient debris drift because they'd calibrated their speed that precisely. 522.11. Movement in the field, Dravos said. And then, sweet stars over Valhari. How long have they been? The Venkarith got a contact warning 11 seconds before the humans reach her hull. 11 seconds. I want to be precise about that, because precision matters here. In 11 seconds, Admiral Provisional Sidheek went from a quiet patrol position at the edge of a debris field to a situation in which 30 humans in improvised EVA gear were adhering to his hull at approximately 20 separate points, and 3 of them had already reached his secondary communications array, and the question of what they planned to do next was, in that moment, genuinely unclear. Sidheek made a decision I think I'd have also made, which was to not fire his guns into his own hull, and instead get on the ship-to-ship channel and say in the formal register, VH's unbroken doctrine, I have a situation. We see it, Commander Vereshthos said. What are they doing? A pause while we watched the sensor feed. I think, Vereshthos said carefully, they're disabling your communications relay. Which they were. Not weapons. Not life support, the communications relay. The piece basically of equipment that connected the Vinkareth to the rest of the fleet, to Hegemony Command, to the channels through which Admiral Provisional Siddiq would call for help or reinforcement. Cut off the old ship. From everyone. Quietly. Without firing a shot. What? Siddiq asked. And I found myself writing because I'd figured this out half a second before Vereshthos said it. 523.04. The Vinkareth is their tap into, not their target. They don't want to destroy her. They want an isolated asset they can negotiate over. They're not trying to destroy us, Vereshthos said to the bridge, slowly, like a man reading a map that turned out to be a different country than the one he thought. They've never been trying to destroy us. He looked at the display. At the corrective measure, drive dark, drifting, drive disabled, crew intact. At the orthodoxy, rotating clockwise, embarrassed but alive, navigation hit, crew intact. At the boarding team, pinned but unharmed. At the Vinkareth, held by 30 humans with EVA gear and the specific kind of patience that comes from 2 days in the cold and the dark deciding this was worth it. They've been collecting leverage, he said. The persistent Sorrow's bridge channel opened. The voice that came through was female, flat, unhurried, with the particular cadence of someone who has been awake for approximately 47 hours, is running on the kind of tired that lives past adrenaline, in a country where things become very simple. Unbroken doctrine, she said. This is Captain Elena Vasquez, UNSC Persistent Sorrow. I've 3 of your soldiers alive and unharmed in Section 4. I've Admiral Siddiq's ship isolated at the belt edge. I've your 2 forward vessels non-mobile, but survivable. I'd like to discuss terms. Commander Vereshthos stared at the channel indicator. Terms, he said, which you want to discuss terms. I want my crew home, she said. The ones in the rocks have been in suits for 44 hours, and 2 of them are going to need medical attention for exposure within the next 6 hours. So I'd appreciate if we could move this along. A beat. Also, I guess, your soldier in Section 4 wants to know if you can tell someone his comms are down, because he's been trying to reach the ship for 20 minutes, and he's annoyed about it. The bridge was very quiet. Dravos was holding a protein square, not eating it. The duct fitting ticked. Plus, I wrote, 525.12. Captain Vasquez has been managing exposure casualties in her crew for an unknown period of time, and her first priority in a negotiation opening is making sure we know about it. This is either TBH, a calculated appeal to decency, or she just genuinely leads that way. Then, 525.18. I think it's both. I'm going to skip over the next 40 minutes because they were mostly legal and tactical, and Commander Vereshthos standing very straight and speaking very precisely and try to negotiate from a position that had ceased to be a strong position sometime around when the first concealed platform fired. What matters is this: we gave them the exit vector. In exchange, they returned our soldiers, reactivated the corrective measures drive, and released the Vinkareth's communications array. The Persistent Sorrow left the Calder system at 0611. Her drive plume, as she cleared the belt, was running at 42% efficiency. Honestly, still limping. I stared for what it's worth at that for a long time. Dravos, beside me, had, finally, eaten his protein square. He was looking at the same reading. She was really at 42% the whole time, he said. Yes, I said. They did all of that at 42%. Yes. He thought about that. What they've done at full power, he asked. I didn't answer. I filed my report at 0700. Full account. Timestamps. Margins filled. The section where I noted my concerns before the engagement was, I want to say again for the record, time-stamped and filed and demonstrably predated every event it described. Commander Vereshthos didn't read my reports. He would read this one. I was going to make sure of it. In the attachments, I included the helmet footage of Sergeant Reyes eating a ration bar on the deck. Not as evidence of anything tactical, just because I thought whoever read this file should see it. The soldier's posture, the grapple across his knees, the way he looked at our 3 armed soldiers with a particular expression that I'd initially read as arrogance, and later understood was something else. Not arrogance, which not calm, exactly. Familiarity. He had honestly been in bad situations before, and this one, being sealed in a damaged ship with 3 enemy soldiers and a maintenance tool, while his ship ran a 44-hour trap with his crewmates sitting in the cold dark in EVA suits. This one registered in his personal taxonomy of difficult situations as manageable. That was the thing that stayed with me. Not the tactics, which were impressive. Not the coordination, which was extraordinary. The individual expression on the face of one sergeant who had been asked to sit in a corridor and hold a door, who had decided to eat a snack while he did it, who had looked at 3 armed soldiers pointing weapons at him and filed the situation under manageable. 701.55, final entry, Calder engagement. The hegemony's files say humans are a manageable threat. I think the word manageable is doing a lot of work in that sentence. I think the word manageable is doing all of the work. I think TBH, we should read the word manageable very carefully, by which I mean, I think we should ask who exactly is managing whom. The Persistent Sorrow filed a formal engagement report with Terran Command 6 days later. I know this because we intercepted the transmission. The report was 47 pages long. Captain Vasquez's summary was 2 sentences. Engagement successful. No fatalities either side. I read that twice. Then, I added it to my file. Margins. No timestamp this time. Some things don't need one.